Well, hey everyone, in this video, we're going to be interacting with some content about the benefits of marriage. And the interesting thing about this video is that it's coming at it from much more of a social science standpoint and a statistical standpoint, which flies in the face of some of the things that are modernly being said about marriage. So let's take a look and interact with this content.
I've got basically bad news and good news to report when it comes to marriage in America today. The bad news is there's kind of like a closing of the American heart, where the marriage rates come down by about 60%. What that means kind of practically is that about 1 in 3 young adults today will never marry. And that's bad news because, and this is the good news, the paradox is the science actually is telling us that, marriage matters a lot for our kids and for our adults and for our communities. In fact, on some outcomes, we're seeing that marriage matters, more than ever. The benefits financially of being married are even greater today, now in 2024, than they were back in 1970. I think.
So this is a really interesting point because, as he's alluding to, this does go against sort of the modern thinking or sort of the popular way that we talk about marriage, and that it's from both ends, both from the men, sort of the manosphere guys who say, hey, like, don't get married, this woman could ruin you financially and that sort of stuff. And then from the women's side, the idea of like, no, like go out and get your career, don't limit yourself by getting married and especially by having kids. So he's talking about the idea that there sort of have become these lines of thinking that have been accepted as practical truisms or wisdom in our culture. It says that the science and the statistics actually don't bear this out. It's not just that maybe we as Christians have an ideology that says, hey, marriage is kind of a bad deal, but we still should do it. It's that the statistics and the science are actually saying, no, this is actually a very good deal for people.
I think the most surprising thing for me was seeing that for young men today, what I was witnessing in the data was that young men who are coming from non-intact families without their married parents at home, they're more likely today to end up in jail or in prison at some point by the time they turn about 30 than they are to graduate from college. And that was kind of a jaw-dropping pattern that I saw in the data. A lot of the voices in the culture today, and I talk in my book about, New York Times columnists on the left and now sort of manosphere figures on the right, like Andrew Tate, have been kind of like basically kind of doing thumbs down to marriage, kind of saying that marriage is a bad deal for people when it comes to their happiness. There was an interview, for instance, in the New Yorker that was kind of depicting faith as an obstacle to flourishing families. Basically left the reader with the sense that, religious couples in America today are more likely to be floundering, not flourishing. And what's striking about, my book is it shows that when it comes to marital equality, actually, typically church-going couples are about 15 percentage points more likely to be very happy. Depending upon the survey, folks who attend church regularly are between 30 and 50% less likely to get divorced. And then when it comes to actually to sex, religious couples today actually have markedly more sex, and they also report more satisfying sex than their secular peers. So I think a lot of the messaging around faith is kind of off the mark.
So before going on to the next section, so the book that he's talking about is his book is called Get Married. And I recommend if you're a reader, read the book, or I actually listen to the audio of the book. It's really worth reading. The guy who's in this video is named Brad Wilcox. What he talked about is really significant. And one of the elements is that when it comes to marriage and when it comes to divorce, one of the things that, there's 2 statistics that are often thrown around a lot regarding divorce that are deceptive or maybe just straight up untrue. The first is that half of all marriages end in divorce. That's actually not true. I think there was one point where it was getting close to that. But it's more around 40 to 41%, which is not good, but is not 50%. And also those statistics are skewed by the fact that when it comes to first marriages, the likelihood of divorce is way lower than when it comes to second and third and fourth marriages, where it skyrockets to 70, 80, 85%, very, very high. The second truism that's said a lot about divorce is that Christian couples get divorced at the same rate as non-Christian couples. And there might be some way that you could make that true, but it's only if you're doing it in terms of self-identified, like you just marked on a census, yes, I'm a Christian and I got divorced, or no, I'm not a Christian. When it comes to actually couples that are involved in their church, where their faith is very important to them. He alluded to the idea of attending services together, which in his book is something he talks about a lot, has a huge impact if couples attend church services together. Makes a massive impact not only on fighting against the likelihood for divorce, but also upping happiness, upping satisfaction. All these different things go along and correlate with that. And you could argue the point, like, is correlation causation? It's not that they show up at the church service and therefore everything is good in their marriage. Maybe things were good in their marriage and therefore they showed up at the church service. Fair enough. But what I'd say is, if you're looking at this and you have not first of all, if you're a Christian and you're like, church, not very important. First of all, church is very important to Jesus. Secondly, if you were just looking to form a family well, statistics bear out that involvement in church is hugely important. And then secondly, if you are really wanting your marriage to thrive and you haven't really prioritized the idea that you go to services together, or maybe, and I've seen this happen increasingly, it's sort of like she's got her church, he's got his church. And sometimes that's a Catholic Protestant thing, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just that he likes his church over here, she likes his church over here. They're both sort of like, high five, you go to your church, I'll go to my church, and we'll talk later on. This is not a good setup. You want the family to be together. This stuff does make an impact on our marriages. And despite what sort of the popular cultural norms would want us to believe, faith does have a deeply significant impact on our marriage and on holding us together and bringing greater joy in our marriages.
So the question is, what is it about religion that's so helpful for couples today? And of course, I'm talking about on average. And I think there are really three things that kind of come to mind for me, and they're about kind of three ends. So one is the norms you encounter in religious communities, often norms like fidelity and forgiveness, which are incredibly important for, a strong marriage today.
In his book, he talked about fidelity there, which maybe in general has to do with sort of loyalty to the marriage, but also has to do with sort of sexual faithfulness within marriage. And he talked about some staggering statistics in the book of the percentage of people that don't think that adultery is always wrong, or that don't think that sort of sexual faithfulness within marriage is terribly important. It's pretty shocking. So when he talks about norms there, that is really significant, to be a part of a church community and a faith community where this is just normal, where we consider this like, this is a big deal. This is what you do if you're married. You stay faithful. You stay sexually faithful. If you strayed in some way, that's going to be really significant. You don't shrug your shoulders at it. You treat it as something that's really significant that needs to be worked through, and God willing can be worked through, and that's where the forgiveness comes in. But if you're only spending time with people who are sort of shrugging their shoulders and saying, that's not that big deal, or who are pursuing some kind of open marriage idea, that's really not good. You want to be around people who are normalizing healthy behaviors in general and in marriage.
The second thing that I talk about is networks, having friends in your religious communities who are kind of with you and for you. And then the final N is what we call nomos in sociology. It's kind of the sense that there's like a meaningful order, what some call a sacred canopy, that sort of stands over you, kind of have the sense that there is a God that's with you and for you. And so as you're dealing with the slings and arrows of misfortune, maybe it's the loss of a beloved mother, maybe it's job loss, maybe it's a teenager who's ending up in the psychiatric ER, every weekend. When you have that kind of faith-based perspective, you're better able to handle these challenges than, your peers who don't have that kind of religious orientation. So these are the kinds of things that I think help to explain why, on average, today in America, faithful couples are more likely to be flourishing than their more secular peers.
So I love what he talked about. So the second two ends were networks, which even if you were simply a secular person and you were wanting to have a good marriage, you just had something in you that said, I want to have a successful marriage. Even if you didn't believe any of the Bible's teaching or the gospel, you would be smart to be in a network of people that take marriage seriously. And it's hard to find networks that take marriage really seriously outside of religious communities. That wouldn't have always been true, but today it's increasingly true. So those networks are significant. And one of the things that my wife and I have talked about over the years is what does it look like for us to have friends who are not only for us, but are for our marriage? What does it look like for me to have guys that when I'm around, if I'm discouraged in some way in my marriage, that they're not saying like, yeah, I can't believe you got to put up with her. Or if Karina is discouraged in with me or disappointed in me in some way, that she doesn't have friends who are saying like, this guy isn't worth it. But that we have friends that are pushing us back towards faithfulness in our marriage, towards understanding, towards forgiveness, towards counseling if we need it, whatever it is. So the networks are really important. And then the nomos idea, which I'm assuming is from the Greek word nomos, which means law, has to do with the idea that there is an overarching purpose to this. And in our culture, I think one of the reasons why people kind of shrug their shoulders at marriage is because it's sort of like, well, I'm just trying to live the happiest life that I'm going to live. And so, I can, I suppose, get married to somebody, but if they stop making me happy or I stop making them happy, why in the world would we go through it? Like, why in the world would we persevere through something like this? And part of this is just that it's foolish on its head, because it's a very short-term view of how you experience happiness and how God has made us as human beings. And the idea of, if I just pursue what makes me feel good right in the moment, that's going to bring me happiness down the line. It's not. So it's foolish on its own. But also as believers, we embrace the idea that the gospel is shown off in marriages. And so there is a purpose beyond just me, beyond just my wife, beyond just our marriage. It's showing off the gospel as we look to live as husband and wife faithfully in our marriage. So having that in mind can lead you to persevere during times that maybe you're looking at your spouse and you're like, I'm not thrilled right now. Like, this is really challenging. This is really difficult right now, but there's something bigger at stake, and that can lead us to faithfulness in marriage because of that.
The case for having children is that on the one hand, they're certainly tough and challenging. I've got a bunch of kids, but I think there's just an incredible capacity both to give love and to receive love. And there's an incredible way in which your life is injected with a sense of meaning and purpose, that you didn't have prior to having children. Mothers are reporting that they're less lonely, their lives are more meaningful, and they're happier compared to their childless female peers. And I think that runs against a lot of the messages we get today about how motherhood is kind of a transition to loss rather than a transition to gain. You might think that married folks, who don't have kids are doing the best on the happiness front, but we do see in the data, in fact, that married parents are more likely to be, happy compared to childless married folks.
It's interesting with the whole sort of reporting happiness. I'm going to take it as something valid, although I think even the idea that happiness is sort of self-reported is maybe not the best metric that we could use, but let's just take it for what it is in this. That certainly is counterintuitive, what he just said right there, and maybe counter to the cultural narrative that sort of like wait real long to have kids, and then if you do have kids, sort of like make sure that you still aren't losing out on things that you sometimes lose out when you have kids. This is especially the message to women, maybe to some degree to men, but especially to women. And then just sort of the normalization of dinks, DINKS, of double income, no kids, of just sort of like, we're living our best life and we've got each other and we're saving for retirement and we're going out on weekends, and just sort of this carefree idea. And then people even talking about how the idea of when you have kids, it's hard to have date nights, it's hard to connect. That's true. I am so glad that my wife and I have kids, and I am so much more bonded to her because we have kids. If we didn't have kids, like it's not that I don't think that we could have a thriving marriage and see each other and connect with each other and have a marriage that reflects the gospel, because you don't need kids in the marriage to reflect the gospel. But man, I feel like kids, while they bring all sorts of challenges, they bond us together in an amazing way. And they're pointers toward the idea that the marriage is about something bigger than just the two of us. And so he sort of is playing it straight here, where he's saying, I'm just going to tell you the data. Like, I'm not, he is a believer, but he's like, I'm not even going to get into ideology and what I think is right and how I think we should overcome our own selfishness and things like that. He instead just says, let me just tell you the data. even if we were to take ideology out of it completely, the path that people are sending us on, when they're sending us on a path to fewer children and to not getting married or waiting longer to getting married or to abandon our marriages, that path is not working even by the metric they used. And we as believers have something more significant than even the metrics. We have something where we have a calling from God to live our lives and to live within our marriages in a way that is selfless and giving and reflects the gospel of Jesus.